Hello. In this clip from our Justia webinar, Elevating as a Leader, Making a Triumphant Transition at Your Law Firm, Scott Mason walks you through risk dynamics and leadership, as well as how to overcome them. If you want to see more Justia videos on law practice and legal marketing, be sure to subscribe to our channel.
As lawyers, what we are involved in above and beyond all else is usually the relationship of risk to our clients' ongoing objectives. Many of us, because of the depth of risk oversight that we're involved in, can come to view risk in the same way that this individual is viewing the place on that cliff that they may jump from, as something that's very scary and to be avoided at all costs. What I'm going to argue here is that for lawyers stepping into leadership role, a right-sized relationship to risk is of absolute importance if we are going to succeed as organizational or firm leaders of any sort whatsoever. So, what do executive leaders and lawyers who are individual contributors have in common vis-a-vis their relationship to risk? First of all, and in general, how are the two functions the same? Both executives of all types and individual contributor lawyers operate within larger interlocking legal and regulatory frameworks, which must be understood and effectively managed. Even if you, for instance, run a business that is largely unregulated with regards to its subject matter, you still operate, for instance, within the regulatory and legal frameworks with regards to payment of taxes, as well as human HR, as well as discrimination and equal treatment, as well as payroll and a whole host of other things. And so a successful organizational executive and a successful individual contributing lawyer need to be able to forecast risk and needs to be able to prepare for them. And that is both at a micro level as well as at a macro level. In other words, environmental scanning the business environment that you're operating in outside of your company, seeing when risks are forthcoming and being able to think about, okay, how might those play out and how can we keep them from being disasters is important for both groups of people. And by the way, it presumably goes without saying, but maybe not, both executive leaders and, of course, lawyers working for those leaders in a sole contributing role share a common interest in mitigating the impact of the risks when they do actualize. Ideally, they share an interest in eliminating the risks at all, but if they can't be, limiting the potential scope and the financial damage that they can cause. But how do the two roles differ when it comes to the relationship that they have with risk? Legal individual contributors operate inherently defensively because of the adversarial system within which we operate and have been trained in from the first days of law school, even if that defensiveness is proactive. And when I talk about proactive defensiveness, what I'm referring to is the idea that we may, for instance, say, let's put this provision in the contract, let's say liquidated damages. And the reason why we put that in there, that's a proactive step. And it is something that's really thinking about actions that are yet to come, but it is rooted in defense of that client should a conflict arise. And so because of that defensive nature and part and parcel to it, an individual contributing lawyer has a narrower role within the organization and therefore a sharper and a shorter term focus within the organization. So for instance, if you are working for an organization that has a lot of facilities, a lawyer working for that company may be mostly concerned with any legal issues related to facilities management, or again, as we've talked about earlier, leases. These have a short-term focus and maybe not necessarily a longer-term focus with regards to the life of the organization, because, hey, most organizations, if they continue to grow and scale, ultimately grow out of or change locations over time. And that goes as to things like litigation as well. Most litigation does not go on, let's hope, for the entire life of an organization. usually at some point the litigation ends and the organization continues. And so lawyers that are working as sole contributors within an organization require a high level of attention to the details that create or minimize risk, the language and things like contracts or in financing agreements, procedures such as filing deadlines or court rules if there's litigation going on, compliance postings, heaven knows, as well as what's in staff manuals, things like that. And then corporate optics can be an important role for individual contributing lawyers, because practically every quality lawyer that I know has at one point or another said to a client, look, what you're doing may not technically be legal or illegal, but it really looks bad. And that's an important function. But it is still different than what a team or organizational leader is thinking about with regards to risk. So usually an organizational leader is focusing on playing offense. In other words, obtaining positive results, and see risk solely within that lens. Will this risk unacceptably threaten our ability to achieve a result? Is this risk worth taking? And how big is the risk? But then they're also considering a whole host of other things: marketing, operations, supply chain, human resource concerns, all these sorts of things. So as I mentioned a few seconds ago, they view risk as only one of various factors that impact business behavior. And they have an eye on issues that occur beyond the overall framework of the risk. In other words, whereas I mentioned a few minutes ago, the lawyer's role and the things that the lawyers are working on don't necessarily go through the entire life of the organization. Many leaders are thinking about the entire lifetime of an organization, or at least the long term, as much as they are the midterm and the immediate term issues that might be facing the organization right then and there. One way to think about this from an executive leadership perspective is an executive leader is thinking, well, what happens the day after that risk is either actualized or it disappears or is mitigated? Whereas the lawyer is thinking about, well, how do we avoid that risk, and then how do we deal with that risk as it is materializing to continually keep it under control? So executive leaders frequently are big picture or strategic thinkers. In fact, the more you step into executive leadership roles, and I know this from personal experience, the less likely you are to be able to maintain a focus on detail. It's just too much. There's too many things to focus on, to be thinking about where a comma is placed. We'll refer to an earlier example. And they are sometimes tactical, but strategy and vision, which we've mentioned a few times already, come into play more and more and more and more, and take up more and more of the focus as these tactics and details are delegated to sole contributors. So how, as an executive leader, do you manage risk? You understand that this complicated relationship exists as an initial matter, and that the way that we are trained as lawyers to think, in other words, how we become lawyers in our minds, can create a certain lens through which we view risk that can be antithetical to successful executive leadership. Once we're aware of that, then we're able to then begin to nip it in the bud when it comes up, and we're able to rethink about how we're assessing problems. And if we find an excess of risk aversion coming up, well, then we're able to at least identify it and right size it with regards to all of the other issues that we need to be looking at. So making that mindset shift that's rooted in acknowledgement is extraordinarily important. Surrounding yourself with people who have different views of risk than you do is of huge positive consequence. So, for instance, I spent a part of my career since, as I moved into my current life, working with a venture studio. And the people that are in the studio, and for those who don't know what a venture studio is, it basically is a company that identifies gaps in the market and figures out creative, innovative solutions to and builds companies around those, invests in them, and then later tries to get those companies up and moving as independent entities out in the world. And anyone who's going to be doing that sort of work is inherently very, very open and comfortable with risk, because anytime you are investing your time and your money and energy into something that is completely new and oftentimes untested in the world, you are not risk averse. And being around people like that allowed me to see how I was addressing risk internally due to my many years of sole contributor legal practice through a completely different lens in a way that was starker than I had ever encountered before. And then you always want to make sure that as you step into an executive leadership role, that you are learning the entirety of the business from soup to nuts, as well as the entirety of the environment that it is in. So then you can, again, place risk within its appropriate larger scale context. So this is not the only thing that you're seeing. But nonetheless, you also want to, as you move into executive leadership, always assess the risk aversion. So if you find yourself, despite everything that we've talked about so far, naturally defaulting into a risk aversive mindset, perhaps it can help you to think as often as you can that what appears to be safety that risk aversion can provide actually can be quite dangerous. Because if you've not leaned into new things, if you view taking bold steps as something that's dangerous and scary, and you bring that into your leadership, well, when the environment that you're in, the external environment, the business environment, the leadership environment within your organization shift, you can be stuck. Sometimes leadership requires taking bold moves. And if you're not the leader that takes those bold moves and someone else, a competitor, does, you can be left in the dust. So risk aversion itself can be risky. And making sure you understand that is absolutely pivotal to managing risk as a leader. And then never, ever underestimate or, heaven forbid, forget the ethical implications of downplaying risk. Note that I mentioned or described the slide as how to manage risk, not how to completely lean into it. If throwing aside risk aversion means that you are putting you or your company or your team at risk or in danger of violating any ethical considerations or the law, then you're going too far when it comes to your newfound love of risk and you want to pull back.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next clip.